koutou, ko Janet Hoek aho. It's my privilege to chair this 5th session in what's been a really outstanding symposium. The earlier speakers have all shared findings that raise and reinforce challenges that we all need to address. And the speakers in this session are going to help us focus on where we go from here. Please remember that we'll have time for questions at the end of the session, so please enter these into the Q&A tab that you can see at the bottom of your screen. And please also remember that if you're tweeting, use the hashtag Otago Spotlight. Our first speaker is Maria Larcombe, who's a research fellow in the Department of General Practice and Rural Health, and she'll be discussing research impact with a focus on equity. Kia ora, Maria.
Thank you. I'll just introduce myself. Ko rangi toto te maunga, ko waramata te moana, ko Pakeha taku iwi, no tamaki makoto aho, ko Maria Larcombe taku ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Now, as Janet said, I'm a research fellow in the Department of General Practice. I'm also working for the Divisional Office of Health Sciences here at the University of Otago. And my role is to support researchers to achieve impact, which is what I'm talking about today. So I'm not actually talking about my own research today, rather giving some overview of what impact is and how we can look as researchers, but also as partners and next users of research to all be able to achieve impact together with a focus on equity. So, as a little bit of background, research impact is about how research makes a difference in the world. This is the Health Research Council definition of impact here, which talks about that impact can occur at an individual, community or societal level, and that equity is a very important impact that can occur from research. I really like the definition myself. It's about real difference in the real world. And I won't go into examples today because we've had such a wide variety of examples of exceptional impact and also how it can be measured with my co-presenters today at this forum. And it's important to note that we're talking about impacts outside of academia, so not just about publishing and sharing our research within the academic space, but getting it out and making a real difference. So when I was preparing for this talk, I read a really insightful blog that I thought related really well to some points that I thought were really important for highlighting in terms of achieving impact with research, looking at equity. And I'm going to go through these points in detail now. So the first one is planning. So this is particularly important for researchers, but also those who are working in conjunction with researchers. So a really important part of impact is can we map our pathway from the beginning, right from what resources and personnel we have, right through to undertaking the research, how we're going to disseminate it, and finally, what impacts are we looking to achieve. A common tool for doing this would be a logic model, but there are many options that are out there. Secondly, within your team and your partnerships, do you have the capacity and capability to deliver your impacts? Do you need to form a multidisciplinary team or invite people in from other areas and sectors to be able to achieve what you're aiming for? It's also important to sit down in the planning stages and collaboratively set research priorities and understand what value means to everyone, because this can be quite different, particularly looking at different communities in the equity space. Another tool that can be used, which I've just come across recently, it's only been published a couple of months ago, is an equity impact assessment tool, particularly aimed at researchers. And I will highlight this again at the end of my talk, because I think it asks a lot of important questions to researchers about how they're planning, undertaking and disseminating their research to aim at having equity impact. And finally, with planning, it's not just about at the beginning, it's important to revise and adjust plans along the way as things change. It's not just a one-off thing. Secondly, we've heard this a lot today, and I've been really encouraged to hear about strong relationships being formed in multiple areas of research in order to achieve equity. So quality relationships are key. These include both within and external to research teams. And again, everyone needs to be involved from the beginning and engaged early through the research planning and execution phase. Particularly looking at creating an inclusive environment for working together can be important, such as inviting collaborators and partners into meetings, and also forming the links outside of perhaps the research, a formal research environment as well. My next point is around impact is about teams, it's not individuals. Particularly in the research space, researchers can be quite focused on their own research because it's what we're measured on often as individuals, but particularly for something like equity, it's pieces of research which fit together, which form a whole. So we need to think about our teams and also reaching out to other researchers. And I would encourage those who are listening today that are outside of the university sector and want to work with us as partners to contact researchers that you're interested in today, and try and work with us as well, because we're really receptive to that. Which closely relates to this next point about researchers are not responsible by themselves for achieving impact. We need funding to go to the right places to achieve equity, and we should be prioritising that. Our decision makers across all levels of councils and government, for example, need to be working collaboratively and reaching out to researchers, working together. So we need to see this shift towards achieving impact in government, business and society. And lastly, be open to continual learning, which is why you're here today. I've certainly learnt a lot, and what I like to hear in these stories is not just about the impact, but it's the story or the pathway of how research has been taking place, which I find the most valuable. It's also important to share failures. Sometimes things don't go so well, and it's important that we can learn and others can learn from that too. Learning can occur in other areas as well, such as understanding how complex impact is and changes. It's not linear as we like to map it sometimes. And perhaps if you're new to this sector, or want to also look at further learning and this relationship building, which is so important, and also specifically regarding equity, it could be around the use of correct language and framing, for example, or further being able to understand how to reflect your findings in a way that is going to reach the right communities. This is the tool that I wanted to highlight that I said earlier. If you have your phone, just as I'm talking, you could open a camera, and there should be a QR code reader on your camera, which you could use, and it will pop up this table which has the tool on it. There is also an article attached, which I find an interesting read. This tool has 6 different parts, which goes from community engagement in the initial stages right through to dissemination and what impacts you're trying to achieve. It's only just out, as I said, so it would be good to get some feedback if people are interested in using it, but I thought it was a really good overall tool to have researchers looking at and prioritising equity from the outset. I can see I'm just in my last 30 seconds or so, so these are the 6 categories that the tool has. Thank you for listening to my whirlwind tour of impact, and I'm happy to take any questions later. Thank you very much.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Maria, for that fantastic overview. And I think in just a few minutes, you managed to give us some really helpful advice, and I'm sure that that resource will be very useful as well. I'd now like to introduce Associate Professor Louise Parr-Brownlie, who's a member of the Department of Anatomy, and her presentation is going to discuss how we can reframe biomedical research for equitable brain health outcomes. Kia ora, Louise. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, he mihi nui tēnei ki a koutou, ko tainui me te arawa nā waka, ko ngā te mene poutou te iwi, no tāmaki makaurau ahau, ko Louise Parr-Brownlie tōku noa. So hello and thank you. I've been really enjoying this symposium. The information has been really interesting, and I am looking forward to sharing something that's actually a bit more of a personal story in this particular session, where I am a biomedical researcher. I research on Parkinson's disease, brain health and well-being, but as I was doing research quite some time ago, I started to realise that some of the things I was doing was not going to create an equity outcome. So I'm going to be talking about deep brain stimulation for brain conditions and some of the research we've been doing about the next generation of deep brain stimulation, then looking at the limitations and how I've started advocating for more equitable treatments for brain research, and then more recently kaupapa Māori research that I've been conducting. So our brain defines who we are, our personality, our creativity and our reasoning, yet for many New Zealanders it actually works differently. Around 30% of New Zealanders live with brain conditions where there is death or overactivity of brain cells that cause conditions like dementia, stroke or epilepsy. And another 15% of New Zealanders have been diagnosed with mental health disorders such as depression and schizophrenia. And this means that an awful lot of New Zealanders are living with brain conditions. And thankfully, for most of these people, their conditions can be treated or their symptoms managed with therapy or medication. But for a small group of New Zealanders that don't respond to these treatments, surgical interventions may be needed. Now, I want to stress here that surgical interventions are usually considered a last resort when everything else has been exhausted. So what we have here, I'm going to first of all talk about lesions. So lesions have been used to treat brain disorders since the 1950s, and in order to do this, a stereotaxic frame is attached to the head so that we can accurately target deep, small and deep brain regions. Then an incision is made in the scalp and a small piece of bone is taken out, and a probe is placed into the brain at the structure, and this probe will either cut or burn a small hole in the brain. And in New Zealand, this is still used for conditions like epilepsy, routinely in surgery. But in 1996, deep brain stimulation was approved by the US Food and Drug Administration and is now used to treat many brain conditions. Deep brain stimulation the surgery starts off the same way. The frame is attached to the head. They have to get into the brain, but this time a probe is inserted deep into the brain, and that probe is attached to a wire that is fed underneath the skin down to a pacemaker that's implanted in the chest. So there are many places in the brain that can be targeted for stimulation or lesion depending on the condition. And most conditions have multiple sites that can be targeted, and the site that is chosen is dependent on the most troubling symptoms. So this image I've got shown here is showing you some of the sites that can be used or targeted for things like chronic pain, Alzheimer's disease, depression, addiction, obsessive compulsive disorder and Tourette syndrome. But the condition I'm going to be talking about is Parkinson's disease, and the target sites are going to be slightly more posterior, but they're still very deep in the brain. Exactly how deep brain stimulation works is not completely known, but if we focus on Parkinson's disease, since we're going to look at a movement disorder pathway, a collection of brain regions need to work together in order to achieve a goal. So this pathway that I'm showing here is the basal ganglia thalamocortical pathway, and information flows in the direction of the red arrow in order for movement to occur. But in Parkinson's disease, movement is slowed because brain cells, dopamine cells deep in the brain die off. And when this happens, the information flow through this pathway is impaired and the people start having trouble with movements. Deep brain stimulation is applied to the subthalamic nucleus, most commonly in Parkinson's disease. And once this happens, the information flows through this circuit and people start to move relatively normal again. To show you how effective this is, I'm about to show you a video of Claire. Claire has been living with Parkinson's disease for about 15 years, and she's been taking the drug levodopa, and she's now experiencing drug-induced side effects from that drug. And you may well ask, well, why doesn't she just stop taking the drug? But in fact, if a patient does that, then they have so much difficulty moving. They spend all their time and all their energy just trying to move, and it's completely exhausting. So Claire is going to exhibit dyskinesias. They're flailing-like movements of her arms and legs. She undergoes the deep brain stimulation procedure. You'll be aware of that because she then wears a hat afterwards, and you'll see how her movements have been restored.
Well, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's in the year 2000, and the dyskinesia, it's much more recent than that. It's been particularly bad the last 4 or 5 months. One thing that's pretty obvious to me is this coffee cup. I was able to drink out of that without spilling it down my front for the first time in a long time.
And how many days since the op now?
About 9, I think.
What's happening with your dyskinesia now?
Oh, it's gone. It's just not here anymore. It's just amazing. It's a miracle.
So it's a miracle. So deep brain stimulation, and part of the information I'm about to say here about surgery is relevant for the lesions as well. But deep brain stimulation is incredibly expensive. It costs about $100,000 per person who receives this treatment. But surgery itself is highly invasive, and it's actually available to very few and can produce the side effects. So for both conditions, serious surgical complications such as infections, stroke, and death can occur. And about 2% of people will actually die from these procedures. In New Zealand, only about 10 people per year are offered deep brain stimulation, and over 10,000 people are living with Parkinson's disease. So very few people get it. And the reason for that is because it is so expensive, trying to get the best outcome, offer it to people that are most likely to respond. But in addition to that, when we talk about Parkinson's disease, it's a disease of aging. So most people get Parkinson's disease over 60 years of age, and yet the one criteria that's going to stop them getting deep brain stimulation is going to be their age as well. In addition to that, stimulation can cause complications. So stimulation can cause depression, speech impediments, cognitive decline. And so one of the things that my lab has been working on is trying to get new technologies that allow the stimulation side effects to be reduced. So we've been using some technology called optogenetic stimulation, but to first explain why the side effects occur. So here's the probe going deep into the brain. You've got 2 contacts and current passes between these 2 contacts. And any cell that's near that will have its activity altered. And that can, so the placement of the probe is critical. And also you have cells in the brain that come from quite a different part of the brain, wander past this probe, and the activity of those cells is going to be altered as well, and they will have a different function. So what optogenetics is going to do, we're going to selectively target only some cells in some regions of the brain, and we're going to put in a light responsive protein in order to be able to control the activity of the cells that we want to activate. So the way that we do this, we use a virus as a gene delivery system. We take the virus's genes out and we're going to replace them with genes for light sensitive protein. Essentially, that protein is going to create or get this channel here to express in our target cell's cell membrane. And then what happens is we can splash pulses of light. And every time a pulse of light flashes, the gate opens, ions cross the channel, the cell can become more active. And so we're able to alter the activity of cells by flashing patterns, light in all sorts of patterns. So importantly, in my lab, what we've been wanting to do is stimulate the brain to recover function, and also, of course, to reduce fewer side effects. So here we are going to be watching a rat. The rat is Parkinsonian. It's been made Parkinsonian only acutely by injection of a drug. And essentially the rat is going to be reaching for food here in this wee platform. Now, because this rat is Parkinsonian, it really doesn't move. It's sitting there, it knows the food is there and it does want it, but it's unable to execute that movement. So in that same rat, after 20 minutes of blue light stimulation, what we see, if you look again where the red arrow is, the rat is able to reach into for the food and obtain it. Now, what is unique about the work that I've been doing, we've been stimulating at a novel site in the motor thalamus, a site that with electrical deep brain stimulation does not work, but there's good theoretical reasons why it should be effective. And we've also been using really novel patterns of light stimulation. So one of the things we've done is recorded from activity of the brain in the motor thalamus when a control rat was reaching. And if that's critical for underlying the movement that occurs, well, what happens if we replay that in? So use the timing to stimulate when the light is flashing. Are we able to recover function? And the answer is yes. Now, the animal comes in, it gets attached up to the equipment, and if this was ever going to be translational to humans, we need to do obviously a lot more testing, but we need a device. So one of the things I've been doing is working with some bioengineers up in Auckland. This is the device that my team has been using for about 5 years now. So we can implant it in, we can stimulate continuously in the animal for over 4 months. And this device is now commercially available. And I was doing this research and we were heading in this direction, and I stopped and I thought, oh, well, I asked myself, do end users actually want what we are developing? And the answer to that is yes, because I do engage with the Parkinson's community, and anytime there's something that provides hope, they want to know about it and they would like to have that offered to them. But I was thinking about this much more from my own family. So we don't know yet whether what we're going to do is reducing side effects, because we haven't put it into an animal that can tell us that. But what is very clear is that it is no more accessible than the current deep brain stimulation that's available. Using viral vectors and implanting probes is not going to be culturally appropriate for Māori, and therefore we are not going to be achieving equitable outcomes. So I stopped and I started thinking about how I was going to address this, because this is not something I felt comfortable with. And so there are two things I'm going to share here. One is I've started advocating for different technologies, not things that I've really worked on at all, but I think are really good solutions for all the problems that I've been sharing with you. So this one, it's called magnetic resonance guided focused ultrasound. Essentially what happens here is that the person is going to undergo a lesion, only there is never an incision that's made. So what we've got here is an MRI scanner, conventional MRI scanner that has another part that's designed to go and gets fitted into that. And essentially the person lies here on this, this bed, gets put into the scanner, their brain is scanned, they know where the target is, they can do a test pulse with 1,000 ultrasound beams, they can adjust the target if required, and essentially they're going to heat up the brain for 20 seconds at 60 degrees, and it creates a lesion, and they can monitor that whole process and know what they've achieved. And what's really amazing, because the person's not anaesthetised, they're awake throughout all of this, this person, when they come out of the scanner, they stay in a low dependency ward bed overnight, and then they go home the next day. Now, I just want to say that this isn't available in New Zealand at the moment, but actually it is something that when I had the opportunity to give a presentation at Parliament from a Royal Society series of talks that they do, and I was talking about medical devices, so I used that opportunity to advocate to MPs about some technologies that are out there. So how does this technology stand up? So focused ultrasound is cheaper. It's about 1/3 of the cost of deep brain stimulation. it is a lot safer. So they've never had a brain bleed, a stroke, or a seizure, and no one has died. It is should be available to many more people, and if we just consider cost, then it would be available to at least 3 times more people. And the good thing about it, although it's creating a lesion, it creates a quality of life improvement that's very similar to deep brain stimulation. But of course, what hasn't happened through all of this, there's been no implant or no surgery, no medical device has been implanted. So this is already that much more acceptable for Māori, because with the boru being tapu, the head being a particularly restricted area, the frame needs to be attached onto the head, but that's all that happens. And if you think about when a person undergoes this procedure, they can have whānau in the room as long as the support person doesn't have any contraindication to being near an MRI scanner. And in fact, they can be doing karakia and completely supporting the person in a culturally appropriate way. So the other aspect that I changed my research direction in, I wanted to start to understand Māori perspectives about the brain, and also perspectives on neurological conditions and neurosurgical treatments. And I've been very fortunate to collect a team, including Mariana Tapo, who conducted all of the interviews that have been done with this project. So we've been working with 2 marae, one near Dunedin and one in Auckland. The participants underwent structured bilingual interviews. Whānau shared their perspectives, understanding and experiences. We heard about challenges and their resilience to what they experienced, and we got quite a lot of insight into how Māori brain health can be maintained. The kōrero highlighted the importance of whakapapa, so I'm just giving you one of the themes that came out. And the photo here is actually of Mariana's whānau, 4 generations, the importance of whakapapa and the importance of being on their home marae is so critical for well-being and being able to navigate and get well again. So some of the major ideas were how whānau provided care to people, to family members who had undergone a neurological event, that whānau support was needed in clinical spaces. Often the people did not feel welcome, but having at least a second pair of ears there was really, really critical. And they also talked about a person's role in collating and maintaining whakapapa knowledge within the whānau, and how the person, the family member they were supporting was really critical for that. Some other key things that I'm not going to talk about, the importance of wairua and how it can be restored, the importance of karakia, and also the use of wai to restore healing as well. So different people want and need different solutions to maintain good health and independence. We all know that, that's what this has all been about, the symposium today. Working at the interface of biomedical science and mātauranga is needed for equitable health outcomes. And what's important about it is that both worldviews are considered and used at the right time and in the right way. But what I did also share today is that advocating for something that is cheaper, meets wider cultural needs, and is more accessible, because the focused ultrasound, the barrier because of age for people that are generally living with neurological conditions, that's no longer the barrier that it was. So many more people would be able to have that treatment. And so having that broader perspective of research, sharing this knowledge widely, even though it somewhat discounts your own research that you're doing within your lab, is so incredibly important. And of course, eventually it's going to change service delivery options within the health system. And to finish up, I just want to acknowledge the funding sources that we received to conduct all of the research that I was explaining. And I've got my Māori perspectives and research team there, and my brain stimulation team, and also all the collaborators who have been involved. So thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Louise, for a really creative and inspiring presentation. I'm sure you've given us all a great deal to think about. I'd like to welcome you back again now, Louise, along with Professor Jim Mann. So we have directors of 2 of the National Science Challenges, Jim, who's director of the Healthier Lives Science Challenge, and Louise, who's director of the Ageing Well Science Challenge. So I'll hand over first to you, Jim. Thank you.
Actually, I'm starting and then Jim will come in much later, a little bit later. So hopefully you can see the slides. So this talk is about National Science Challenges. It's in 3 parts. The first part first part is about National Science Challenges, who we are and what we do. We wanted to put that on the table to make sure everyone understood what we are trying to achieve. And then I'll continue and I'll talk about Ageing Well National Science Challenge very generally, and also the journey that we have been on as an organisation to introduce structural change that is absolutely required in order for equitable outcomes. And then later on, Jim will come and talk about healthier lives and then give some examples from the Healthier Lives Challenge about how they've been, the research processes that they've been doing, and give some examples from the research that they've funded about will create equitable outcomes. Okay, so National Science Challenges, they started in 2014, but they started after public consultation that began in 2012. And so the government reviewed or consulted very widely with the public to find out what New Zealanders thought were the major opportunities that science could solve in New Zealand. And that was really important because one of the 5 principles around National Science Challenges are that we have to be mission-led. So this whole process actually started mission-led, going out to the public, and even now, and that they defined who the challenges were going to be, and within each challenge what the research focus was going to be. But now that the challenges are established, we can still continue to do mission-led research because we get our communities to decide what the research should be. Science quality is, of course, very important, but maybe not in the more traditional Western science perspective. So impact factors and citations, yeah, we want to know about them, but actually making sure that we have the best science to answer these huge mission-led questions is what we're really about. And in order to do that, we've got to have the right research team with the broad range of skills across institutions and across with broad skill sets as well. We've got to have stakeholder engagement and public participation throughout all the processes that we have to make sure that it remains mission-led. And there has been a very strong requirement for Māori involvement and mātauranga to be included, and that we have to give effect to the vision mātauranga policy that the Ministry of Business Innovation actually have. And I just want to say that Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment actually provide the funding that gets devolved to us. There are 11 National Science Challenges and they're incredibly broad. So they go from climate change, essentially, through to things that New Zealand as a country needs to change so that we can be resilient to natural disasters. Some of the challenges have a very corporate or innovative requirement that they have to deliver on. So every challenge is very different. There are 3 health challenges, and I've got them at the top left of the diagram. And interestingly, the health challenges were divided along the lifespan. So a better start is Pepe and Tamariki, Healthier Lives Pākeke or adults, and Ageing Well is for kaumātua. And the National Science Challenges are housed at different institutions. So only 4 are within universities, most are in CRIs, and some are in government agencies. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that the amount of funding that we get is incredibly different. So interestingly, the 3 health challenges get the least money of all of them. And when you combine our total, it is still smaller than the challenge that gets the most money. So we're not trying to we can't do things the same way because we're really getting different pools of money. So within the national science challenges, each science challenge needs to give effect to the Vision Mātauranga policy. And so within each challenge, people were working away, and that is not the best way for this to be done. So in 2018, we collected, and I put the term loosely as Māori directors and Vision Mātauranga specialists, because we all have different role names, but essentially we're the person who's engaging and making sure that the challenge delivers on the Vision Mātauranga policy. So we came together and started to consider how we might do this more collectively, so that as a group we have better outcomes for all of the science challenges. So we share and extend best practices, practice approaches to Vision Mātauranga. We provide a collective Māori voice, particularly in the national science sector space, but also more broadly. We want to innovate and advance Mātauranga Māori. We want to accelerate RSI, research, science and innovation benefits for New Zealand's benefit. And we want to influence science policy to deliver benefits for whānau, hapu, iwi and diverse Māori communities. And the way that we've done this, so we as a group get our funding to support what we do collectively from each of the science challenges. So everyone just gives a little bit and we make it go an awful long way. And the photo that you can see is a wānanga we held at the end of 2019. The outcome from that, we actually put out the Vision Mātauranga Guide in June last year. That guide has 3 major areas in it, talks about Māori experiences within the science sector. It explains what the VM policy is and how it should be applied. So that particular section is focused on broadly for everyone to read in the science sector. And there's also a section about the future and what government agencies and research institutions will need to do. Earlier this year, we put out to pūtahitanga. So this is, again, recommendations to change the science sector so it's treaty-led. And those recommendations are over short, medium and long term. So basically, we're signalling that some things need to change. So changing over to ageing well. So our vision is to add life to years to all New Zealanders. So in recent years, our lifespan has increased, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the experience that people have in those later years is the same. So our mission is to harness the science to sustain health and well-being into the later years of life so that all New Zealanders can reach their full potential. Now, interestingly, challenges are hosted by the University of Otago, so we remain somewhat independent, but we do sit within the university. We also have 8 other collaborating institutions, which are illustrated there. As I said, I'm going to give you a little bit of an evolution about our challenge and how we have changed structurally to become, to go from what was a very much a Western framework, we work within a Western framework, to become a Tiriti-led organisation. Now, those structural changes started in 2016, and at that time, Dave Baxter had been the director of Ageing Well for 2 years from its inception, and there'd been lots of changes in management and leadership within the science team up to that point as they were trying to refine everything. But in 2016, Di McCarthy, who was the previous CEO of the Royal Society, became the chair of our governance group. So together they had a vision, and it started to roll out. That vision started at governance level. So most science challenges originally had a governance group that made all the strategic decisions, and then sitting alongside that was a Kāhui Māori group, who was essentially advisory to the governance group. And the governance group could choose to listen or not. So they took this opportunity and they combined the Kāhui and governance into one organisation, one group. And there were very strict rules around that, about the membership of that. So we have 7 members of our governance group since it combined. 3 have to be Māori or Pacific, and in fact, I think it has always been 4. And we currently have 3 Māori, 1 Pacific, and 3 Pākehā, and 3 women and 4 men. And we've had that for quite some time, and it's absolutely wonderful. So governance changes happened first, and then management changes happened. So Dave was the director, and what happened was they introduced a deputy director Māori position, and initially that position was filled by Moana Theodore. And she did a lot of the engagement for our phase 2, what we were going to be funding and how we were going to be doing it. And then she had an opportunity to conduct research, and I stepped into that deputy co-director, deputy director Māori role. And essentially my position has evolved through from deputy director and eventually became co-director, and now I'm the director. And then as we found out we got funded for the second 5 years of the challenge, we changed our advisory group. So we made sure we had really good Māori representation so that we had that advice. So we have essentially what is often considered a science leadership team, a strategic advisory group in our case, where we want to make sure we have people that have experience in the DHB, working in policy, working with communities and so on, science communication, and they advise us on how we should do things and making sure that our research focus is the funding that we support is correct as well. And we also have an international science advisory panel, and we do have a Māori member on that as well, a New Zealander, because of the specific expertise that is needed. So Di and Dave had a vision. They created space. So I came into the deputy director Māori role, and the governance group had a deputy chair role, and Will Edwards took that position. But in 2020, things evolved again, and Will and I stepped into our respective current roles. So we are a Māori-led organisation. Because of the evolution that we've been undergoing, that means that we've got our vision mātauranga and how we do things has gone from compliance, what we need to do, to actual opportunity. How far can we stretch this? How far can we do this differently within the science sector? And so within our organisation, Māori values and principles are, of course, really important. Tikanga determines the processes we use and when we engage and how we engage. But actually, we want to take that a step further. So we are in the process of documenting what, as an organisation, what Ageing's Well's values and principles actually are. So what we're doing differently is that we're starting from a Māori perspective. We're bringing all our researchers, all our Māori governance members together, and we will create a Māori worldview of what we believe our organisation is. And then we will go out and consult with everyone within our organisation to refine and get that so everyone feels comfortable. Now, we were meant to be doing that in a month, but of course, COVID has meant that we've had to stop that and put that to the side. So we hope that we'll be doing this early next year when we're able to move more freely around our environments. And the last point that I've got there is equitable outcomes start with equitable funding. So as we were getting ready to go to bid for our second 5 years of funding, this is what we put on the table. So around the outside on the circle is the 3 major focus areas we have: dealing with physical frailty, enhancing role in society, and maintaining brain health. And in fact, they were decided from the public consultation done in 2012. And so they are still there and they are still important. But what we did is how we split up the money. So we have 2 million that goes to strategic opportunities, and that's things that we co-fund with other people. In some cases, it's Healthier Lives. In some cases, it's the 2 other health challenges. And we've also co-funded with HRC and ACC. And that was a Māori focused equity funding intervention. So even in our strategic funds, we are making sure that funding going to Māori is there. The main pots of money, half of the funding goes to ageing and Māori. The other half goes to health and wellbeing and ageing generally. And any funding that we we look at supporting, they have to deliver on vision mātauranga. There has to be equitable outcomes. Intergenerational relationships are so important for Māori and so important for most people. So we want those considered, and also life course approach is important. We don't start ageing when we turn 50 or 65. Ageing is a continual process. So we always will be considering that. So are we delivering on equity? And in my opinion, the answer is yes. We are a Māori-led organisation at the moment with embedded processes and values. We privilege mātauranga alongside Western science. So we believe that sometimes Western science is going to be the best way to answer things, and other times it's going to be mātauranga. So it's very specific to the project that is being done. We have equitable funding for Māori, and we are building, as a consequence of that, we're building a diverse and inclusive research sector. And our Māori careers are flourishing within the organisation. So people are stepping through into leadership positions, and as well, we are supporting early career Māori researchers and community-based researchers as well. Our research teams need to be collaborative. They are multidisciplinary, and we wanted that for a paradigm shift. And if I look at our non-Māori led projects, 88% of those have a Māori researcher on the team. And even within there, ageing is framed positively, holistically, and we use a strength-based approach. And kaupapa Māori research, because it's driven by communities, is of course mission-led. And we'll have robust code development, code delivery, and code dissemination with the communities that they work with. And we have to have line of sight of the research, line of sight from research to the impact on service delivery, resources, and policies, so that we improve the ageing experiences for kaumātua. And this is my last slide before I hand over to Jim. If you want more information, I've got the URL for our website. We also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. It comes out about every 2 months. We recently put out the Celebrating Aging Well book. It documents the first 5 years of the challenge. So it talks about the research, it talks about the role that communities and stakeholders have had, and more importantly, it talks about the impact that this mission-led research is having. And I've also put up my email address as well. So the Aging Well book, we've tried to release this twice this year. Twice it's been not been able to happen because of COVID lockdowns. So we're about to put it on our website in the next day or two, if you'd like a copy. And so at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Jim.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Mann tēnei. But starting with my first slide, which is really an attempt to give you some idea of what Healthier Lives, Hei Oranga Hauora National Science Challenge is about. We were given a huge task, which, as you can see from the Gazette objective and the target diseases, was we were told to reduce the burden of the major New Zealand health problems, particularly focusing on cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. And we were given $31 million over 10 years to deal with that problem. I think probably everybody would agree that it was a pretty tall order. We developed a vision, which we thought was a little bit more realistic, which was one of Aotearoa New Zealand with equitable health outcomes and a substantially reduced burden of non-communicable diseases, fully acknowledging that the contribution we would make to that vision would be limited by our resources, despite all our enthusiasm. The work of the challenge really fits into 3 themes. And you can see the 3 themes up on the right-hand side of the slide. The first one is really a population-based approach, which is based on the principle that our target diseases are potentially preventable to a lesser or greater extent by appropriate nutrition and physical activity. So theme 1 is about what we might research in terms of creating a healthier food and physical activity environment. Theme 2 acknowledges that Māori and Pacific are really the populations or the parts of the New Zealand population which bear the greatest burden of our target diseases, and also take into account our obligations to te tiriti. So theme 2 represents a community and whānau approach to reducing the burden of these diseases. Finally, of course, we acknowledge that there are a substantial number of people in the population who have already developed disease, and we should not neglect that group of people. So some of our work is in fact targeted at individuals. Most importantly is the last little point on the left-hand panel of the slide, the cross-cutting principles which underpin all the research which we have supported and funded. And that is, achieving equitable health outcomes has been forefront of our mind when planning our research. We have acknowledged our obligation to te tiriti, and we have also taken on board the fact that if we're going to do research with these principles, co-design with next and end users has to be a major feature of our research. So what I'm really going to talk about in my presentation today is the principle of co-design, the principles that we started with and the lessons that we've learned about co-design. And I guess, of course, one has to acknowledge when talking about co-design, and this has been alluded to in a number of different ways by other people who presented today, most recently by Maria just a short time ago, that when you talk about co-design, one of the things I think one has to acknowledge before even starting to talk about co-design is that there are a number of different definitions of co-design, a number of different approaches to co-design, and a substantial number of frameworks which have been suggested. We did not assume that we had the answer to co-design, but underpinning our thinking right from the beginning was that we wanted to establish authentic partnerships in our co-design process. We really accepted a couple of other principles, and that is that we really needed to ask stakeholders and end users about their priorities. And we had to build community relationships from the very earliest stages of the research design. So there were these principles underpinning the planning of our research. What I do need to say right at the beginning is that we, given the limitation of our funding, and given that the whole concept of the science challenges was to undertake mission-led research, we decided that a significant fraction of our research investment was going to be towards commissioned research. We have in fact undertaken the more usual form of research, contestable funding, but primarily our research has been commissioned. And given that we have undertaken commissioned research, we have actually developed a very robust system for assessing research proposals, which really involves co-design, or in fact, the co-design incorporates this robust assessment of proposals. And I would like to acknowledge co-director Andrew Spall, who has played a key role in developing this process. And there's been a lot of interest in it. We've also designed contracts to ensure that co-design is a major feature of the research which we have commissioned, and that the process of research planning has taken on board the potential for implementation at the end. And I'll come back to the issue of implementation a bit later on. So I would love to have the time to tell you in some detail about the various projects which we have undertaken and are undertaking as part of our package of research. But I'm just going to mention some of them. And if you would like to learn more about them, some things have already been published, but you can certainly go into our website and learn some more about them. But in particular, I am going to talk a little bit about starting clockwise from top left-hand corner, the Pacifica Pre-Diabetes Youth Empowerment Program, which I'll just say a word about now because I won't come back to that. I mean, this was the evaluation of a program which empowered youth to influence the families and the communities in terms of developing healthier lifestyles with a view to diabetes prevention. Moving over in clockwise direction, there is a program, or rather a project, which I think has been incredibly important, which I will talk a little bit about, which is the Hepakinga Waiora program. Ora Ora is next, and Mana 2 is bottom left, and I'll just run through those very briefly before I try and summarize the lessons that I think we've learned from these. I particularly want to draw your attention to the Hepakinga Waiora implementation framework, and to acknowledge the people that are involved in developing this framework, which has now been utilized quite widely already in New Zealand and overseas, in Canada in particular, where this implementation framework, based on kaupapa Māori, it's a kaupapa Māori framework, which has Indigenous self-determination at its core. And I would draw your attention to the resource toolkit, which is available if you are interested in this. But it's basically a framework for ensuring that research which is translated into health interventions work for Māori communities. As I say, I'd love to talk more, but I encourage you to have a look at it. Ora Ora is a totally different project, which is one which is based on mHealth, the development of an app for Māori and Pacific communities, led by Cleonini Murku, with a number of colleagues who have worked with her. And the model of co-design was completely different, adapted from the Stanford University approach. And I must confess, I was quite surprised when initial consultation, which explored what we could research that was believed to be helpful to Māori and Pacific communities wanting to achieve a healthier lifestyle with the aim of reducing the risk of non-communicable disease, came up with an mHealth program and developing an app. So a fascinating program, again, which you may wish to look at further. Mana 2, you may well have heard of, because it's been very widely publicized throughout New Zealand, but this is a program which has been evaluated, led by Martiri Harwood from Auckland, and it stemmed from the fact that we knew perfectly well that people with diabetes were not engaging with traditional approaches for the management of diabetes. So this is a Māori, a Kaimanaki-led program, which part of it is Kaimanaki-led, part of it is GP-led, part of it is headed by the National Hora Coalition. As you can see, there is a whole pattern of involvement which is very, very different from the traditional diabetes care that people have received. And each of these programs have involved a different approach to co-design. So what are the lessons that we have learned from co-designing research in healthier lives? Debbie Goodwin has undertaken an evaluation of these projects from the perspective of the co-design that is being used. She has interviewed researchers and community partners in these different programs and projects, and will produce a report which we hope will be released later on in the year. And I don't want to steal the thunder of the report, but I do want to end off by giving you some of the lessons which I think we have learned. I think lesson number one, and I'll come to the slide, what is on the slide to end up with, but I think important lesson number one is we have to ensure sufficient funding for co-design aspects of research. And frankly, existing funding models do not really allow for this. We have to allow time to develop relationships of trust, where everyone has a clear understanding of their role and responsibilities. You cannot simply jump in boots and all and start planning research with partners, with stakeholders. I think it is incredibly important, and I think that Maria mentioned this, the need to be flexible. It may well be that the idea that you enter research with is not going to be the research that the community, that end users really want. So if one doesn't enter this with flexibility, there is no hope of achieving the outcomes that we really seek. I think it's important to remember what we are asking of the community in terms of time and intellectual property. Co-design involves a major commitment from the people, from the communities with whom researchers are collaborating. I think we need to plan for outcome. Co-designed research has got to have a clear outcome which the partners need to buy into. And I think there is enormous risk of relationship breaking down because people will be let down if there is not a very clear path for outcome of co-designed research. And finally, and what I really want to summarize on this slide, is the humility with which research needs to be planned and research needs to be undertaken. This is really a quote from Debbie's research, and to some extent it is a teaser for the report which will, as I say, emerge in a few months' time. But we as researchers need to accept that we may have valuable skills and expertise, but the real experts about their lives are the communities and the individuals in those communities. We've got to be humble. So I really just want to end up with a quote in the bottom left panel, which I think is certainly very humbling to me. And it is a comment from one of the respondents in Debbie Goodwin's research, and referring to one of the Healthier Lives researchers, who will obviously, I will not mention by name, but this is all done without us knowing to whom people are referring, but we could easily identify who this researcher was. The researcher came across very humble, like he knew nothing. We knew everything, even though we know that he knew stuff, you know. So he was willing to learn from us as much as we were wanting to learn from him. Never pushed those boundaries, never ever came across like he knows more than we did. So I leave you with a message that co-design is really a lot more than I ever realized when we started on this journey, but it has been a fantastic learning journey for us. I think everybody in Healthier Lives has found it exciting, and I hope that when you see Debbie's report, you will find it useful, as indeed we have, just from the experience that we have learnt from her review so far. So I think I've just done within 15 minutes, Janet, and time to end.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Jim. I'd like to turn now to introduce Professor Jo Baxter. Jo directs Kohatu Centre for Hauora Māori and also co-directs the Māori Health Workforce Development Unit. And Jo's going to be talking about Māori health workforce development and equity. Kia ora, Jo. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou, tēnā koutou katoa, taku mihi tuatahi, ki ngā mana whenua o ia rohe, he mihi hoki kia Peter Jackson, mō te whakatuwheratanga o tēnei rā, hoki ki ngā kaikorero katoa, mō te rā, rauranga te rā mā, tēnā koutou, kia ora roa tātou katoa. So I'm just going to share my screen, and then, hopefully, it will all go swimmingly. Great, from beginning. Cool. Okay, so well, kia ora tātou, ko waio, ko tūto, ko te mauka, ko makawhi o te awa, ko kaitahu ka te mā moe me waitaha o ko iwi, ko ka te maha ki te hapu no te tai o pautinu o te waipai na mua hau. Well, kia ora everyone, and it's my pleasure to have, I think probably what might feel like a bit of a speed dating experience for you, in terms of talking about Māori health workforce development and equity and our learnings from a 10-year journey with Māori health workforce. And in terms of the research that's wrapped around this, we've taken an approach where there's been consistent and persistent research and evaluation associated with our activity. So although it's not specifically about one research process, it's something where we've engaged with equity, but been underpinned by the use of research, knowledge, evaluation, and evidence informed. So I want to start off by acknowledging the amazing team that is the Kohatu team that I work for in the Māori Health Workforce Development Unit, and also wish to acknowledge the Ministry of Health, who provides much of the funding and resourcing for what we've been doing. So I want to start off with just a bit of a context about why health workforce and equity. And of course, when we talk about health equity, we often focus on health outcomes, diseases, and health services. And very rarely, when you have an equity conversation, do people focus on the health workforce themselves. So that's what I want to do today. And I think if we think about health sector performance, including performance with regards to equity, it not only involves the health sector structure and systems, the determinants of health, but also who are the people who work in and implement those systems and structures. And we saw very much from the cancer presentation this morning about the real impact and importance of the decision making that clinicians make, for instance, but also where services are positioned and who gets access to which services and in what ways those services are delivered. So if we think about health workforce as well, and I've just got a couple of stats here that come from a recent report, we also recognise that health workforce is a massive industry, and about 11% of people who are employed in New Zealand within an industry context work in the health industry. And so when we're thinking about the health workforce, and often we're thinking from an equity perspective about how do we ensure we have a health workforce that represents equity, we must recognise that the health workforce itself, being employed in the workforce, having an opportunity to engage with the workforce, has an opportunity for equity as an outcome overall. So there's really good evidence for why having workforce representation and diversity in the workforce is really critical for health outcomes and for health equity. And so research that's come out of nursing has shown this, the diagram on the left, with if we have increased workforce diversity, it increases quality and access, it decreases health disparity, and it leads to health equity. And a further paper by Williams et al. Really talked about the dynamics for why diversity of the health workforce and why representativeness in the health workforce is important, and that for communities to engage with the health workforce and to see themselves represented in that workforce enhances communication. it increases services to those communities, it builds trust in healthcare, it ensures that there's greater advocacy for groups, and it supports greater influence on colleagues, teams, organisations and systems. And so if we think about all of the benefits of having that diversity represented and reflected in the health workforce, then if we flip that around, then what is the impact on a health sector who hasn't had that kind of input into it? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because I think what we often don't do is to think about this from a privilege perspective. If we have a health sector that is largely representing a workforce, and the I think, Jim, the co-design story is a little bit along these lines. Who has been the designer? Who are the deliverers? Who is deciding what is quality or not? And who is determining what are the best approaches in terms of access, support, and all of the things that happen in the sector? And if people are not represented in that, then obviously it won't be them that is fully influencing those services. So if we have a look at, and I'm now going to spend the rest of this kōrero focused on Māori, if we have a look at what do we know about the roles of Māori health professionals, and this comes from 3 pieces of research that we've undertaken over the years, and this is research from looking at Māori medical graduates and what are the sorts of things that they're doing in their roles to make a difference for Māori health. And we did a survey a number of years ago, and the kinds of things that people were doing, they were doing leadership roles, they were providing mentoring and guidance, they were incorporating knowledge and expertise into a whole range of things. They were supporting communication, getting involved in training and education, and supporting relationships. And what we recognised from the people we surveyed is that this was on top of their day jobs. So many people were out there making a difference in the services they were working in, but as well as that, they were doing all these other things in order to make a difference. And in fact, many of them reflected that if they didn't do it, there wouldn't be anyone else to be doing these things. And so really highlighting people desperately trying to fill gaps, but recognising that they had a real opportunity to make a difference. So what is the gap that we've got, and why is this so critical? And if we look at these figures in terms of the Māori population, and we look at the health workforce, and very concerningly, only between 2 and 5% of New Zealand's dentists, doctors, physios, pharmacists, oral health practitioners, and less than 2% of our radiation therapists are Māori. So these are the programs that we have at the University of Otago. So when we graph that and we look at it over time, so I started off, I looked at the medical workforce over time, but then I've looked at all of the others, and I could have put up 6 different graphs, but they all look like this. So if we were to apply this to a health issue, we would be mortified if there was a level of inequity that was so massive. So if I take medicine, for instance, there's 16,500 doctors in New Zealand, and just over 500 are Māori. And so when we're thinking about Māori health workforce inequity, then one of the challenges that we have, or 2 challenges really, one, the inequity is huge. And I think within that, where do we start? How do we tackle this inequity with a gap that is that big? So if we map all of the different ways and approaches that we can be thinking about tackling equity gaps in health workforce, and this isn't by any way a fully comprehensive set, but we see that there are issues related to addressing aspects at systems and structures level. We can be looking at the education sector, the health sector, pathways into health careers. And I just want to focus on where our team has been working, which is working in the education sector and largely at the pathway from students within the compulsory sector through into tertiary sector and out into health professional programs, and then into from programs into the health sector. And as part of that, we'll be able to give you a bit of information about some of the research knowledge that we have been learning along the way. So in 2010, we established, with the support of the Ministry of Health funding, a Māori Health Workforce Development Unit to increase the recruitment, retention and achievement of Māori students. And our goal at the time was to see if we could grow the Māori health workforce through growing students coming into and through our health professional programs at Otago. Our starting point was about 4% across our students in the division being Māori, and our goal was 20% by 2020. So we set ourselves a fairly aspirational 10-year goal. Over a number of years, we established 4 different suites of programs, and I'm just going to go through those now. So our first program was Te Ara Hauora, which is secondary school engagement, and a number of programs. There's photos here. The REACH program is year 13 students from all around the country who are really interested in careers and health. They come down, they spend 3 days with us, but we're also working in partnership with a whole range of different organisations, Marine Studies being one where we run gifted and talented programs for years 9 and 10 and year 11 Māori students and a range of others. We have our Tukaheka Foundation Scholarship, where we take up to 20 Māori students a year and wrap a really comprehensive set of support. These are students really committed to health, however, who really want to engage with health but have significant disadvantage in terms of the educational experiences to date. So they come here, they experience university, they get support, and we have had fabulous outcomes from that program. We have our Health Science First Year program where we provide a whole range of support, and there's photos of our students there. We provide one-to-one support, group support, and then full support. And then our program that supports our professional students and our health sciences students into and through degree programs once they're in health professional programs, but we also support students across a range of programs in the division. And again, there's lots and lots of engagement, whakawhanaungatanga, and probably if we were going to characterise what we're doing, each of the programs has academic support, lots of information, there's pastoral support. We work in collaboration with the Māori Centre very, very closely. Whakawhanaungatanga, we provide cultural support, career development, and a whole range of responsive and practical support. And each of the programs is underpinned by best practice. And so what I learned very early on in getting into this education space is that I happen to be a doctor, and education is not my experience. So I'm very fortunate to work with very experienced Māori educationalists who have really developed and led the components of the programs. And the other thing that we have done in the last couple of years is we put our hand up to a new project, which is to support all students, Māori, non-Māori, who are coming from decile 1 to 3 schools, and that was based on the evidence that there was massive inequity in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of entry into health professional programs. And we have modelled the support for these students on what we're doing with Māori students. So a bit like Louise's kōrero, where what is good for Māori is good for everyone, we're also applying that within this program, and with really fantastic outcomes. So the research and evaluation we have wrapped around it has been a mixture from fairly responsive evaluations where we have very, very strong student voice throughout, but also whānau perspectives, school perspectives, constant quality improvement, but as well as that we've undertaken some specific projects. One of these is Weaving Our Worlds, which was an Ako Aotearoa funded project to look at how we got better socioeconomic equity outcomes within our programs. I've got another project working with the South Island DHBs on the transition into workforce and a range of other projects. So these are some of our outcomes over the years, and if we go back to the sort of 2009, so up until prior to 2011 when we started, we were averaging, I think 30 was the max, but probably averaging between 20 and 30 Māori entering all programs, so across all programs prior to that, and now we're up to between 70 and 80. This is just from Health Science First Year, so we obviously have people coming in from graduates. So big increases in the number of students entering health professional programs. And we've also had a growth in the number of Māori students coming to Otago. So again, prior to establishing the Workforce Development Unit, we had less than sort of 60 to 70, between 60 and 70 on average. And it's been a bit up and down with COVID, but over 200 in recent years coming into health science first year. The number of Māori students now present across all health professional programs, and there's pipeline growth, but also we have a very high level of completion. We have a 97% completion rate across our programs. Means that we now have over 400 Māori students across all our health professional programs. And these are happening across many programs. We've had recent increases in physiotherapy, Bachelor of Dental Surgery, and then in medicine, where we now have almost 300 Māori students in medical school across all years. And there has been some recognition of this. So when we looked at all of the pieces of research and evaluations, as well as what we got from Weaving Our Worlds, we recognised that there were some key things that were leading to the success. We unpacked privilege, and we have a very non-deficit framing approach centred in Māori values, student whānau-centred, clear strategic program logic, line of sight between what we do and outcomes, and clear and timely, relevant and responsive programs. Also, it was reflected in, and this has varied, but we have had quite strong leadership and support. And I want to acknowledge Peter Crampton and the Mirror on Society policy that came in a couple of years after we had started the Workforce Development Unit and really wrapped a supportive policy over and around what we were doing. Research and evaluation and data informed, lots of collaborations, relationships, and then obviously a huge mihi to our staff, but also the students themselves, who are the most incredibly inspiring group of young people I think I've had the opportunity to meet. So just in summary, I think if I pull this together, we have stark inequities in health workforce in New Zealand for Māori. It's unjust, it's unacceptable, and has massive impacts on health outcomes. And would we have such a health sector that is not meeting the needs of Māori as we do now if we had been more committed to ensuring we had an equitable health workforce? So it is a tale of two inequities, and unfortunately education is the gatekeeper for the health sector, and so education needs to really get its act together over this issue. And however, there are successful strategies that can change the outcome, and we can do this. And then finally, our learning is that evidence-informed, culturally responsive strategies and programs are effective in beginning to reduce inequities. And by beginning, I can say that our medical proportion has gone from 3.4 to 3.8%. I know Auckland's working really hard, but this is a long and hard game. And even with these gains that we have, there is some precarity, and I think the issues that we experienced on the Mirror on Society last year shows how precarious everyone's perspectives on how important these gains are leaves us vulnerable, and we have a long way to go. However, there's commitment to these gains, and that's me. Kia ora.
Well, kia ora. Thank you so much, Jo, for an amazing overview of such a comprehensive and thoughtful program. We've got a few questions, so if all our panellists could come back online. I'd just like to start with one question, which I think really relates to all the presentations. So one of them is asks, why does the health challenge work stream, and I think that really applies to health research programs in general, get the least funding compared to others, both in the National Science Challenge, but I think it's a challenge across all the areas that we work in. So maybe I could start with you, Maria, if you would like to comment on what we can do perhaps to attract more funding or get funders to recognise the kind of equity challenges that we're facing and support the work that's being undertaken to address those.
Thanks, Janet. I don't know if I can answer specifically to the National Science Challenges, but in general, I think our funders are asking us for us to write a plan when we're submitting grants about what impacts we're going to achieve. And so they have said to us, equity is a priority. So it's the people that are assessing those applications and being able to recognise when people are able to, they've really got that plan in place to be able to achieve the equity. That's what we should be looking at funding. And I think, perhaps we also need to think about particular streams of funding, and do we need to prioritise, if we're really serious about this, do we need to prioritise this as a separate stream? Could be a conversation, for example. But yes, from a funder's perspective, I think it's about understanding when researchers are telling that story in their application, being able to recognise that and say, look, yeah, this is worth funding. This is really important.
Okay, thanks. Now, Louise, you are there. Thanks. Would you like to add anything to those comments? I'm glad your video's working again.
With the National Science Challenges, the decisions on the funding were made over 10 years ago. And so it probably reflects where New Zealand was at the time. And even at our midway review, they didn't adjust that. What I'm aware of is that the ministry is very aware of how successful we are. They see the value in what we do and how we're able to do it differently for better outcomes. If there is going to be a phase 3, further years of funding, it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out.
Okay, Jo, you're at the top of my screen there. Do you have any comments on this sort of challenge of getting greater recognition among funders for the kind of work we've been discussing?
I think one of the challenges that there is that there are a mix of stakeholders with this, including the people who want the information and the people who need it to be implemented, through to the people that are funding the research. And so I think somehow or other it would be really useful to get those groups together more so that there could be real clarity around if it's really important and people want that information because it's going to really make a difference, how do they come together and support it with resourcing? And I think sometimes the benefits and outcomes fit one sector and the funders are another sector or another group. So that may help.
Okay, thank you. And Jim, any final comments from you? I know this is a point you touched on frequently.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could just tell you the reason why we got less funding, because I was involved at the beginning. The question was asked at the beginning. And as Louise says, the decision was made at the beginning. And it was very simply the inappropriate explanation was we as health researchers get loads of money from the Health Research Council, so we don't need any money. It's all those other poor people that needed the money. It was a very poor excuse, but that was the official explanation.
Okay, well, look, I know we're slightly over time now, so I think we'll finish the questions here. I'd just like to thank all the speakers in this session. I thought it was absolutely fantastic listening to the work that you've done, and a wonderful way to round out what's been a very thought-provoking day. So I'd like now to hand over to Professor Rosalind Kemp, who's going to add a few words in conclusion.
Kia ora koutou, ko tua wharepapa tamonga, ko mai tai te awa, no whakatua hou, ko Ros Kemp taku ingoa. Kia ora, I'm Rosalind Kemp, I'm an immunologist at the Dunedin campus. I'm the Associate Dean Research for the Division of Health Sciences. I just want to say, mostly thank you all for your participation today as speakers, as panellists and attendees. Also do just a small apology for wearing my running gear. I'm in lockdown with a 4-year-old and opportunities for exercise are very small windows. So I'm going to go for a run immediately. So just to get back to the forum, our vision for this forum was to highlight our divisional research as a really active contribution to creating equitable health outcomes. And our goal was that every individual at this forum would leave and think, what is there that I can do tomorrow that will lead to change? So this could be a commitment to learning, a refocus of our own research priorities, or perhaps a plan to contact someone to create a new research partnership. So our goal very much was to to provide actions for people to take away. I'm really encouraged by the presentations today that demonstrate the feasibility of real change in research directions and in priorities that can be led by the researchers across the division. I'd especially like to take this chance to thank Michelle Coleman for all of her work putting this forum together. It was a really enormous topic to take on, and it's been incredibly successful, but definitely not straightforward. I'd particularly like to acknowledge the stresses over the last few weeks. Michelle's had to handle first an issue with flights and payments, then the loss of the venue because of the earthquake assessment in Wellington, and then finally, of course, the pandemic and the national lockdown. So it's a real credit to how hard she and her team have worked to put this together. Lastly, all the talks today have been recorded and they're available on request. Thank you again for all of your attendance and participation, and thank you especially to our speakers. I'll now hand back to Jo to close our meeting with karakia.
Oh, kia ora tātou. We're just going to finish up with a karakia for the day. Kua mutu a mātou mahi mō tēnei wā. Mana ki tia mai mā katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, ai o ki o Aorangi.